to be speaking about double-crested cormorants and protected areas in the Great Lakes. Gail is an associate professor at York University. Her background is in ecology and animal behavior. She has her PhD in biopsychology from Memorial University in Newfoundland, a Master's of Science in Zoology from North Dakota State University, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Minnesota. Her two main areas of research are the environmental management of offshore oil and gas and the ecology, conservation, and management of avian wildlife. In addition to York University, she has professional affiliations with the Adler Institute, where, I said that wrong, the Alder Institute, where she's an associate. The Alder Institute is a non-profit collective dedicated to representing an ecological point of view in public discourse and to translating science into common language. Alder's mandate focuses on, but is not limited to, the natural history of Newfoundland and Labrador. They have a flagship radio show, Open Air Natural History Radio from Newfoundland and Labrador, and they have a weekly broadcast for 1 hour to the Eastern Avalon Peninsula, and it's available online if you're interested. And the second affiliation is the Waterbird Society, where she's a member. And the Waterbird Society is an international scientific not-for-profit organization composed of biologists, researchers, conservationists, students, and other interested in behavior, ecology, and the conservation of water birds. I do have a couple of brochures here if you're interested in taking a look at that society. So please give Gail Fraser a warm Shellback welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come talk to you about double-crested cormorants. This all happened, I was at somebody's cottage last summer and I gave him my 1-minute elevator pitch on why he shouldn't hate cormorants, and then I got this invitation. So I have an ambitious outline here. For your audience, I'm mostly not talking about my work. It's a compilation of other people's works about cormorants. If we have time, I will talk a bit about some of my work that's specifically at the Tommy Thompson Park. So I'm trying to get the mouse to work here. There we go. This is a bit blurry because I took it off a manuscript, a paper, published paper. But this is a historical and current breeding locations for double-crested cormorants. And I'm using this slide to just say that they are native to North America. They are a native bird to North America. And I'll come back more about location. I have, when the birds arrive to the breeding grounds, the males do this very goofy display. I liken it to a cormorant imitating a turkey. They compress their body, the bill and the tail go up, and then they flap their wings and go whoo, 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 and it carries for really long distances. You can hear it. So this is an advertising display, probably of males. It has not been confirmed, but we're assuming it's males doing that. And this is a student that I recently had where we looked at that behavior in its ecological context. And I do have a video of that. If we have time at the end, I can show you a clip. Cormorants nest in trees, and they have the average number of eggs that they lay each season is around 3. They will nest on the ground. And this is typical of almost all seabirds. Both males and females are required to be present and accounted for to successfully rear their young. So they're foraging away from the colony sites, and it requires both individuals of a pair to pull off chicks. And also true of most seabirds is that both males and females look alike. So you cannot, this is a slide of a male and a female, and you can't distinguish them apart. So it's called monomorphic. They're monomorphic, and they're monomorphic. They're not like a robin where the female is duller and she's doing more care for the young than the male, because the selection, evolutionary selection pressures are coming from both sexes. The females want as good a mate as the males want a good mate, and so they're looking the same. And some of the traits that they're using to select the pairs is this fabulous colored mouth. You know, I'm going to just show, because I'm getting baked here in the sunshine. Just show. Yeah, it's just like getting roasted here. Okay, so they have these fabulously colored mouths. That is a sexually selected trait that they use in a courtship display, and it's great to watch them because they'll really go. You know, they're really showing each other their mouths when they're hanging out with each other, so it's super funny. And they have delayed reproduction, so they won't start reproducing until they're 2 or 3 years old, and that's cut off a little bit. But the mean life expectancy is 6 years old. But a banded bird has lived as long as 18 years of age. Oh no, okay, we can do it. So the title of this section is Double-Crested Cormorants and Historical Perspective. So early on, I think it goes forward rather than backwards. There you go. When Europeans first arrived, there's a quote from somebody as early as 1634 that identified cormorants as a competitor for fish, right? And they noted in this quote that they will destroy the abundance of fish pop and small fish. And Lewis was the first person who wrote a PhD on double-crested cormorants and essentially summed that since the European arrival, that cormorants have endured a history of persecution and gradual abandonment of their breeding sites. So this is in 1929 when he wrote this paper. So throughout the 19th and early part of the 20th century, humans worked quite hard at trying to eliminate cormorants from the landscape. There is a debate in the Great Lakes, and I would say there's not much of one, but it's in the public domain, so it's important to identify it. There was a paper that was put out as an Environment Canada fact sheet. Chip Weslow is a colleague of mine. I work with him. He knows a lot about cormorants. And they suggested in this fact sheet that cormorants never existed in the Great Lakes, and they colonized the Great Lakes starting in Lake Superior, starting in 1913, and then spread eastward. But other colleagues of mine, Linda Wires and Francie Cuthbert, who I'm quoting a lot today from their, pulling out a lot of their work, wrote an extensive paper on the historical, they did a lot of history dredging on what we know about cormorants in North America, and they argue that the Great Lakes has always been part of their range. And one of the things Linda says to me is like, they're a water bird, they were to the south, they were to the west, they were to the east. Like, why wouldn't they be in the Great Lakes? And she managed to come up with 3 lines of evidence. I'm just giving you some examples. It's a great paper. If you have an interest in this, I can send you the PDF. But it's in the Waterbirds Journal with this peer-reviewed work. And one of the pieces, as an example, is that the Ojibwe had named a rock in Georgian Bay that means the cormorant head. So the Ojibwe had knowledge of cormorants before Europeans arrived. And then another example of the evidence that they used that cormorants were in the Great Lakes prior to 1913 was the North American Bird Checklist from 1886 identifies the Great Lakes as cormorants being in the Great Lakes. Cormorants exist high on the food chain. They eat fish, and they can accumulate pollutants that bioaccumulate. PCBs and DDTs are an example. And there was a research biologist, he still exists, he's actually written a book, The Dismal State of the Great Lakes, that recently came out. And but in the 1970s, James Ludwig was very concerned about the state of water quality and the amount of pollutants that were in the Great Lakes. And one of the outcomes of cormorants bioaccumulating these human-provided pollutants was that their populations were at an all-time low. They, like raptors, couldn't lay eggs. The legs were super fragile. The eggs would break. And that PCBs caused this cross-billing of young, which essentially prevented them from being able to eat and exist like a normal cormorant. And so, so cormorants have been, populations have had problems with contaminants. So this is a graph. I'm trying not to show you too many graphs today, but there's year on the x-axis, a number of nests in the thousands on the y-axis, and it starts in 1920 and goes to into the 1990s. And so essentially, it shows, particularly in the 70s, this population was at an all-time low. People were very concerned about cormorants. They were put on endangered species lists in the United States. They were added to the Migratory Bird Convention Act in the United States to give them more protection. There was a lot of effort to remove the pollutants from the environment, and they were one of the species that benefited from this. And so there were a lot of factors that went into helping the population recover. But I just want to say here that from 1920 to 1980, that's several generations of humans that were in the Great Lakes that just never really saw cormorants. They never saw them, so they think that they don't belong here. Right? So the population did recover, and Environment Canada identified that as a conservation success story, and it was an indication that they have, there's other contaminants that have come up, but certainly the PCBs and DDT contaminants have drastically dropped, and that's still being monitored. It's really flame retardants is the next problem. But and through that recovery and rapid growth, there's still this is again a study from Wires and Cuthbert, a different study, and this shows the U.S. colonies in the Great Lakes, the cormorants. They're still only occupying between 1977 and 2007, they've only ever occupied 3% of the thousands of islands in the Great Lakes. 3%, and a combined area of less than around 1%, and they identify that as an over calculation. But this recovery has resulted in conflicts, in human-wildlife conflicts with cormorants. This is a quote that the person is likening cormorants to having rats in their house, and it's related to fish. So the conflicts for fish, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but I want to give you a sense of how complicated those questions are. There's a main conflict over aquaculture sites that primarily are in southeastern United States, but also Minnesota. And there is conflict over sport fisheries as well as commercial fisheries. So I'm just going to spend 2 slides to give you a sense of what it takes to answer the question, are cormorants impacting a particular fishery? So a particular fish species in a particular space and time. So the first question you would need to ask was, does a particular fish species show up in the cormorant diet? And I'm not showing you cormorant regurgitation today while you're eating lunch. So what you'd want to do is you want to have an accuracy of the methods employed. You can use pellets from the guano, you can use regurgitation, you can get stomach contents, which involves killing the bird. So there's 3 main methods. Ideally, you'd have more than one method to cross-verify. You would need to know the number of the quantity of fish that's showing up in the diet. You would need to know the size of the fish that's showing up in the diet. Is it breeding fish or they're before they're breeding? And you would need to know the age of the fish consumed. So that's one piece of, so does a particular fish species show up? And then, if yes, then you would need to ask the question, how is the fishery negatively impacted due to cormorants? Okay, so, and I broke down these questions more. So first you need to know, what is the definition of your impact? And I give one example here of you can have a financial loss that's attributed directly to cormorants. you would need to identify the spatial scale at which you're asking the question. So is the fishery for all of Lake Ontario you're talking about, or is it by Toronto, is it by Hamilton? Like, you need boundaries to answer that particular question. You would need to consider the impacts of other things on that fishery. So I give some examples of other predators, pollutants, competition amongst species for your particular target population. And how are the fish trends measured? So is it by catches of human catches, or is there some systematic way of measuring the trend in which you're measuring the fish population? And you need to know something about the dynamics, the population dynamics of the fish population. So how does the fish population grow? What's the age structure of the fish population, right? So you can see it's really complicated, and it's not good enough to go, there are this many fish, we killed this many cormorants, and this is how many fish we have after we killed that many cormorants. That's not good science. That's not repeatable science. It's not good science, right? So a lot of the fish studies do not measure up and actually showing that cormorants have had a negative impact on a particular fishery. The other concern is cormorants' impacts on other water bird species that nest with them, and I have a picture here of black-crowned night herons. And there's some questions here. I don't spend a lot of time on it. This is something that I've looked at Tommy Thompson Park. But you need to know the trends for each species, for cormorants and the other species that you're concerned about. Ideally, you'd have observations of direct interactions between those two species. And you need trends in reproductive success that can be directly linked to cormorants. But I do want to say, and I know you're all eating, that it's not all negative for other species to be coexisting with cormorants. Gulls and black-crowned night herons regularly forage within the cormorant colony, particularly tree nesting birds down at Tommy Thompson Park. And because cormorants will just vomit, like there'll be trees blowing, and they're just super sensitive birds, and they'll regurgitate food. But also this great photograph, which I have these motion-sensitive cameras that I have set up at the park at different times, captured a black-crowned night heron eating a cormorant chick. So these species that are with them, may incur negative effects at times, but they're also getting benefits from existing with cormorants. The conflict that I'm going to spend the most amount of time on today is around habitat modification. So cormorants nest at unusually high densities for other birds compared to other birds, and that alters their guano alters the soil and changes the soil pH, and that ends up killing the trees. I like to call it habitat modification. Right, so they do modify the habitat, and if I have time at the end to go into this more, I will do so. Okay, so these are four main conflicts: agriculture, fisheries, other species, and habitat modification, and they have resulted in intense management, particularly south of the border. And there's three types of management that I'll just briefly discuss: culling, egg oiling, and non-lethal deterrence. So in the United States, I did have these as blue dots, but my husband said they should be guns. There are 23 states that fall under this public resource depredation order that was issued in 1998. And essentially, it's like open season on double-crested cormorants. If you think you have a conflict, you don't even need evidence, you can go kill cormorants. If you're a federal agency, a state agency, a tribal band, whatever. And then the stars are sites of aquaculture sites that they also have a permit that just allows them to shoot cormorants on site. And then we also, in Canada, it's a slightly different handgun, have had undertaken 3 culls of different time periods, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And Linda Wires, who has a book out on cormorants, has estimated 300,000 cormorants, adult cormorants, have been killed in the U.S. between 1998 and 2012. And the more recent estimate is close to 500,000 birds from, if we go up to 2016. So in the Great Lakes, between 2004 and 2007, there was an estimated 30,000 birds were culled, and that's around 2.2%. Another strategy to try and control cormorant populations is to use egg oiling. So what people do is they go in after cormorants have laid eggs, they oil the eggs, and that prevents the eggs from developing, but it also locks that pair into just staying with the nest, because they don't know that the eggs aren't going to hatch, right? So if you just went in and destroyed the eggs, they would just lay another set and go on, right? You know, but if you oil them, then you're kind of locking them into trying to see if they're going to hatch, right? And so this is done, and I don't have the stats for you there, but it's like hundreds of thousands of nests have been oiled in the United States. Non-lethal deterrence, which is I'll talk about more at Tommy Thompson Park. This is one example that was used in Hamilton Harbor and also in Presque Isle. It's like one of these Santa dolls that randomly moves. This is like a scarecrow, but it freaks out cormorants, right? And so they will not nest on the ground. It typically doesn't work for trees. They will not nest in the areas where these mechanical dolls are. So in Ontario, there's been 3 sites that have engaged in cormorant management. Point Pelee National Park, the site is Middle Island. It's a Carolinian forest, and I have one more slide that I'll talk to you about it, but they've called over 12,000 birds between 2008 and 2012. Presque Isle Provincial Park also undertook a call, and as well as egg oiling, because there were birds nesting on the ground there. And then Tommy Thompson Park is where I'll spend some time talking to you about their management. So how do birds respond to this kind of management of being shot at or egg oiling? This is a study out of Lake Champlain, and you have a colony where this is a ground nesting colony, and they have marked birds. So the birds are banded, like this bird down here. So they have really nice visible color bands. Each region has a color code. This is our color code for Tommy Thompson Park. It's actually black on white. So they've marked birds. So the treatment was they egg oil half the colony. All the nests in one area get egg oiled, right? And then there's the control colony that's nearby where no egg oiling has occurred, and they also have marked birds there. And okay, here we go. So if they did the egg oiling at night, when there's no gull predation, they saw an increase of dispersal of these birds moving away from the site of 3% compared to the control site. If they undertook the egg oiling during the day, which is when all of the jurisdictions are doing it, they saw a dispersal of 20%. So 20% of the birds that were nesting on that island, the next year went somewhere else, because they saw gulls eating their eggs. It wasn't the egg oiling, it was the gull predation that happened while the egg oiling was undertaken. But Dewar et al. Out of the study essentially concluded that birds respond to repeated nest failure, and how they respond is they leave and they go somewhere else for the following year. This is a graph, I'll walk you through it. It's numbers of nests on the y-axis, year on the x-axis. The red is the US islands. SLR is St. Lawrence River and Canadian islands that have cormorants. This is Presque Isle, the black is Presque Isle Provincial Park, and the blue is the Toronto and Hamilton area. So there's 3 different time periods. This is when cormorant monitoring began, colonies began. Then there was some growth, and then in in 95, the US management of culling and egg oiling began. And they saw a drop in that population, and simultaneously there was an increase at Presque Isle Provincial Park. And then the third one is there's a decrease at Presque Isle Provincial Park and an increase in the Toronto Islands and Hamilton Harbor. We don't have marked birds to show that birds were leaving Presque Isle Provincial Park and showing up at Tommy Thompson Park, but they almost certainly were, based on other studies. And the quote from the Ministry of Natural Resources for Presque Isle Provincial Park said, "Future analysis of results of cormorant management activities at Presque Isle will need to consider the influence of the broader landscape." This is from Middle Island, Point Pelee National Park, and there's just wanted to pull you out this quote, but they're essentially saying there's high immigration from other colonies that are getting heavy management being done on those colonies. And they say, due to disturbance and management displacing cormorants at other colonies in the Great Lakes, birds are showing up on Middle Island. And specific to Middle Island, and every year they're making decisions about whether they're going to do a call, but their goal is to reduce the number of nests in particular areas of this Carolinian forest from around 4,000, this is the original environmental assessment, to around between 400 and 800 nests, right? So thousands of nests, and each nest is 2 adults, right? So, but what this means is that that's continuous effort to keep population density at a certain number. If you have a population that's going like this, and you want it down here, that means every year, you're gonna have to go in and kill birds, every year, right? And this is resources, this is public resources that are going into this endeavor. And I would argue that instead of mitigating the birds, that you mitigate the effect of the birds. And the example that I give here, so this is Point Pelee National Park, this is the boundary, right, this is farmland. If instead we used money that would be put towards controlling cormorants, just say, we're gonna let them have Middle Island, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna take some resources, buy some adjacent land, regrow a Carolinian forest that's adjacent to the park and include it in the park. And the cormorants are not going to show up here because it's not on the water, right? So there are ways to be thinking about mitigating the effects of cormorants that are at a landscape level. And that's exactly what we need, how we need to be thinking about cormorants. I had a conversation with somebody last night that she's like, they're on our island. It's like, well, nobody owns, like unless you're private and you actually own an island, right? But it's, the landscape is everybody's, it's not just humans, it's shared with a lot of different organisms. Okay, so Tommy Thompson Park, I forgot to start my stopwatch, so I'll have to just give me a waiver. It's weird, and you guys probably all know the history of it, but it's human-made. They started making it in the beginning of the 60s, so the next shipping boom, so it's all this rubble. But by the 70s, endangered common terns and ring-billed gulls saw this as great habitat, and they showed up and started using the site. And then there was the designation of Tommy Thompson Park on the right-hand side, and it was designated as an environmentally significant area. In 2000, it was identified as an important bird area because of the global populations of water birds at the site. It has little dinky birds and songbirds and stuff, and people love that, but it really was the water birds that got it the important bird area designation. And then in 2015, the dumping has stopped. The whole site's going to be turned over to the Conservation Authority, and it now has this designation for all of the Leslie Streets, this environmentally significant area. So this is the trend of double-crested cormorants at Tommy Thompson Park, and I specifically stop it at 2008 because I'm going to talk to you about the cormorant management that occurred since 2008. We have number of nests on the y-axis here, and then this starts in the 1990s when 6 pairs of cormorant showed up at Tommy Thompson Park and started nesting. The black line is the overall trend of the population. The red is Peninsula B, which is here, so it goes A, B, C, and D, Peninsula B. The blue is Peninsula A, so there's always just been very low numbers of cormorants on Peninsula A. The light blue is when cormorants started nesting on Peninsula C, over here. And then the yellow is when they started nesting on the ground in Peninsula B. Okay, so they've been on 3 out of the 4 peninsulas, A, B, C. They're not nesting on D. But with this trend in mind, the TRCA was concerned about conflicts over the loss of forested areas at Tommy Thompson Park. And so what they did is that they got together a cormorant advisory group, which I was part of. That group was to provide input and advice around cormorant management at the park. And importantly, the TRCA specifically identified that their goal was to achieve a balance between a healthy cormorant population and the other users, the other values and uses of the park. So they wanted a balance. But importantly, they said that the management would not involve a lethal cull. So that was not on the table. And rightly so, it's within city limits. You can't be running around shooting things, right? Okay, so even though the cops do it, but I guess whatever. Okay, so this is 2009 in Peninsula B. This is the ground nesting colony. And so the primary management goal of the TRCA was to say, let's try and get birds to nest on the ground. Let's get them nesting on the ground and out of the trees. And, sorry, okay. So this map shows the 4 peninsulas. So Peninsula D, they're not nesting on, if I can get them, there we go. So Peninsula D, this is where the Sailing Club has access. This is where the bird banding station is. So cormorants are not going to be allowed to exist and breed on Peninsula D. Peninsula C is where they have been, but they will not be allowed to nest on the ground there. These dark lines are identifying areas where the Conservation Authority is actively deterring, non-lethal deterrence of cormorants. They're not going to let cormorants expand into these new areas in trees, but unlike other jurisdictions, they identify peninsulas A and B as being cormorant conservation zones. They're like, cormorants can exist here, and we're going to let them exist here. And so, in contrast to the management that I showed you that was going on in the States, instead of saying we're gonna keep population levels at a certain number, they just said we're going to contain them, and we don't care how many there are. We're going to just say there's cormorant conservation zones over there. So they're managing it spatially, not by numbers. What that means is that they hire a ground crew every year to prevent cormorant expansion into new trees. And this is really what it means to do that. So these young people go up with these really long poles, and they'll knock out nests out of new trees that cormorants are trying to move into. And these nests are, they may be just built, they may be from last winter, they may be, they're not knocking out nests with chicks in them, right? So they're 10 days or old or less. So new nests, and they just, because once a cormorant starts building a nest somewhere, they become very persistent. And so they're just continually knocking out probably the same birds. So they're knocking out nests, preventing expansion. This was an experiment that we did. We said, let's try and attract cormorants to nest on Peninsula A. They had been nesting there, but they weren't nesting there. And these are decoys. So these are not cormorants on the top panel here. So those are fake birds. They're plastic birds. And I had a student, Alona Feldman, and she did an experiment with this and trying to get birds to nest there. And there's an example of a decoy here where Gull is sitting next to it. Okay, so there was lots to the study, but what I'm going to do is just summarize the following. So the TRCA is undertaking this deterrence at other parts of the park, right? And that includes noise. They're like doing bangers, they're shouting at cormorants just to prevent it. So they're undertaking this deterrence. And we looked at, on the days they undertook deterrence, did we see more cormorants visiting this experimental plot, these decoys? And the answer was no. So we concluded that deterrence did not result in more birds nesting on the ground. And this was actually a big help to the Conservation Authority, because they said, oh, okay, then that allows us to really then focus on these very particular areas where cormorants are trying to expand and really narrow in their efforts. Right? And the next piece of management, so cormorants, it took a long time because Alona started working on this in 2009. But in 2014, cormorants did start nesting on where we had the experimental plots and the decoys. And then not only did they nest there, they started expanding there. So this is 2015, and this is 2016. It's now up to 500 pairs. So it's been a great success at trying to get cormorants to nest on the ground on Peninsula A in their conservation zone, in the Cormorant Conservation Zone. The next thing that we considered, and I say we because the Conservation Authority and I were working on this together, was to minimize disturbance to the existing ground nesting colonies. So in 2008, I showed, or 2009, I showed you that there's like a close to 1,000 nests on the ground on Peninsula B. And there's signage there. If you've been walking around down there, there's signage to the public to say you shouldn't enter this. This is you cause disturbance there. So there's signage. But the Conservation Authority and myself were undertaking research and nest counting and things during the day. And so there was a decision to, oh sorry, I don't know what's going on here. There you go. There was a decision to only access the ground nesting colonies at night because of this issue of gull predation that I was talking about. So if we went in there during the day and counted nests, then the gulls are coming in and they're eating the cormorant content. Well, the cormorants aren't going to be happy and they're going to move, right? And they may move up into the trees. So that was the decision: no diurnal access during the day. And but I still wanted to be able to do work and observations, and so we built a blind. So this is a tunnel. So this is on Peninsula B, and I myself or students would kayak out along Peninsula B, access this tunnel, crawl in, and then sit in this blind. And that's where all the photographs that you've seen of cormorants that I've taken are from this blind. Right? And so that allows us to be there when the birds are nesting, but not disturb them. But we did need to go do things like nest counts. They're now switched because the ground nesting colony is so large. They're doing aerial photographs rather than ground nest counts. But this is an image of being out at night doing ground nest counts, and it was surreal. It was like being on like Galapagos Islands or something. You know, there's just tons of birds, and then there'd be these party boats going by, you know, and you're counting cormorant nests. And we also undertook some banding of chicks, where a small group of us would go out and band chicks. And so this is the ground nesting colony now in 2016. So we think by the sole, remember, so deterrence doesn't really result in birds getting on the ground. And we think by the sole management action of deciding to not access that colony during the day, that it has grown almost 900%. So it went from 1,000 nests on the ground to it's close to 8,000 nests on the ground. Right. So this is a management action that has had huge success because these birds are nesting on the ground. They're not nesting in trees. And it's quite surprising